And share screen. Where is it? All right. Can you guys see this?
Yes.
You see my screen? Okay.
Yeah, we can see it.
Yeah, with that being said, again, I do want to give it a quick disclaimer that there are some graphic images in here, and they may be offensive or too graphic for some viewers. So I do want to say again that viewer discretion, is advised with some of the things that we'll be looking at. But I want to start out with a doctor that I listened to several of her lectures. Okay, her name is Dr. Joy DeGruy Leary. Okay, and she came up with a theory called post-traumatic slave syndrome. All right, and we'll get to that, but I kind of want to paint a picture for you real quick. Okay, imagine that you were, pulled from your house. Somebody came into your house, snatched you up, and took you off to a land that was, far away, that you were unfamiliar with, where everything was different. Okay, and your wife was taken, or if you're female, was taken up into a plantation owner's home, and you were raped. All right, your husband, who saw that this was going on, couldn't do anything about it. He had to stay in the field. He had to watch as his wife was taken away into a slave owner's household where he knew exactly what was going to happen. All right, the following day, if that male said something about what happened, maybe he just said, "Hey, boss, I didn't like what happened," etc. They would then take him and beat him mercifully. Ooh, am I saying that right? Mercifully, until he couldn't breathe anymore, almost to a point of death. And they would do this in front of everybody else. The following day, maybe your children were sold off to another plantation owner where you would never, ever, ever see that child again. You never knew what would happen to your baby, and you never see them again. All right. And you experience this over and over and over and over again. Multi-generational, you experience this kind of trauma. Question that I have for everybody on here is, did you hear about them, then going and talking to a therapist? Did they go to a therapist? Did they go see Miss Williams Chandler and talk about their problems and get, self-care advice on how to cope with all these traumas? Did they get any medicines to deal with their anxiety that they had? Absolutely not. Okay, absolutely not. This Dr. Joy DeGruy Leary, she comes up with this theory called post-traumatic slave syndrome. And she said that it's passed on, even currently in 2020, it's passed on from generation to generation. All right, that this is a sustained multi-generational trauma that is continuing ever since the beginnings of our country. It could be either experienced or secondhand. For example, many of us have seen the murder of George Floyd, and you witnessed a traumatic event. Even though it was secondhand, you weren't there physically, you still experienced that traumatic event. Now, what Ms. Dr. Leary says is that post-traumatic slave syndrome is very similar to post-traumatic stress syndrome. But she says that this is experienced by all African Americans in our country. So let's take a look at PTSD real quick, post-traumatic stress syndrome or disorder. All right, so these are some of the symptoms.
I'm sorry, Marvin. Hi, whoever that is, would you mind muting? Everyone mute your phones or your computers, please, so we can hear Marvin.
Oh, no problem. Thank you.
Thank you.
So here's some of the symptoms of PTSD, right? A feeling of foreshortened future. So this feeling that my life will not be a long one, okay? A lack of healthy esteem, not good esteem or bad esteem, but a healthy esteem, a healthy view of oneself, a healthy self-concept that you are worth something. Is a lack of that is a symptom of post-traumatic stress disorder. Exaggerated startle response. Now, I don't know about y'all, but if there was a big bang in my classroom, a lot of my Black students would immediately jump up and run to the door and then say, who's shooting, or just playing around. But that exaggerated startle response that a lot of races don't experience. Feelings of distress, of just being stressed out. Feeling an angry outburst. Hey man, you stepped on my shoes. I've seen kids fight over cookies in the lunchroom because somebody knocked a cookie out of their hand. Angry outbursts. Feeling emotionally numb. Now, I think a lot of us can attest to this right now in the current environment that we're living, of this numb feeling. I've heard so many times, myself included, I'm just tired. I'm tired, okay? Hopelessness and a compromised immune system. Let's think about the Black community and the disproportionately large amounts of diabetes in the Black community, hypertension or high blood pressure, heart disease, all those things. These are all generational, multi-generational symptoms of what Dr. Joy DeGruy Leary would say is post-traumatic slave syndrome. So real quick history lesson, right after the Civil War ended and slaves were freed, we had this period called Reconstruction, where the 14th and 15th Amendments were passed. That's great. It made African-American males, it made them citizens, gave them the right to vote. You had Black politicians. I put politicians in quotations because they really, a lot of them didn't know anything about politics. They were just enslaved literally a month before, but now they were actually able to be a part of, you know, state legislatures and Congress, those kind of things. 600 Black politicians were in state legislatures right after the Civil War. We had 16 African-American men in the US Congress right after the Civil War. And there was about another 1,400 that held local positions in their districts or districts and stuff like that. And then obviously you had the introduction of historically Black colleges where Blacks were now being educated for the first time. All right. Now put that shirt there though. How many of y'all have seen this shirt before? Danger, educated Black men. That first word is really important because for a lot of people, an educated Black man, that is something that they fear. Okay. Let's talk about slave patrols. All right, so slave patrols, when they first started early in the 1700s, all right, the Carolina colonies were the first to actually have a formal slave patrol. This was the very first formal policing in the United States. Now I say formal because there was informal policing up in northern colonies and stuff. They were mostly volunteers who would come and actually like just police their area. And a lot of it had to do with notifying each other about impending danger. Again, we're still talking about, you know, King George and the Redcoats were still around. So of course, you know, they were kind of self-policing each other with volunteers, but the first formal policing that occurred was in the South, and they were slave patrols. And they had three main objectives. One, to chase down runaway slaves, return them back to their owners. They also wanted to provide an organized terrorism. Let me say that again. It was organized terrorism to deter slave revolts from occurring. All right, you had people like Nat Turner, who a lot of white Southerners were scared of something like that happening again. So they had these slave patrols to kind of check these slaves, okay? And to maintain a form of discipline. Now, after slavery, after 1865, these same slave patrols, they still had a purpose. A lot of it was controlling now these freed slaves, because these freed slaves, quote unquote, needed to be controlled. They also enforced a lot of the Jim Crow laws that we'll talk about. And also they tried to deny access to the political system. Now, here's a part of history that a lot of textbooks kind of like gloss over, but it's one of the most important parts of our country, is the nadir is what it's called. And by the way, I know I might be going a little fast. I'm trying, because there's a lot of information. I don't want to bore you too much. If you guys have any questions at any time, please just interrupt and ask, or whatever it may be. But the nadir, let me talk about the word nadir real quick. The word nadir actually means right beneath or below or under a certain point or time period. Okay, so we're talking about the nadir is a point underneath the time period that we call slavery. All right, the nadir is a word, I don't know the scholar who actually said it, but we're talking about a point right after slavery that is a point underneath that time period we know as slavery. A lot of people will say that from 1877 to 1920, we had the worst amount of racism and discrimination in our country, even more than during slavery, which is hard to imagine. But let's talk about why. So this is right after Reconstruction. Remember, I just told you in Reconstruction, we have Blacks who were politicians for the first time. They're getting educated for the first time. And now, of course, do you think Southern whites were happy about all this? No, they were still upset that slavery was over in the first place. So now we introduce this thing called convict leasing, all right? Basically, in a nutshell, what this meant in indentured servitude is these freed Blacks now, they would serve or they would work for somebody for about 5 to 7 years, at which point then they hopefully raised enough money that they could basically buy their own plot of land and they could be free and have their own property and their own land. The only problem with that was a lot of these freed slaves didn't have any money to start with. They had to then borrow tools, equipment from their former slave owners in order to do their job. That costs money. If they broke a shovel, if they broke a plow, they then owed that plantation owner more money. And eventually a lot of these free slaves owed so much money to their former slave owner that they could no longer buy themselves out of debt. And in essence, now we have a different version of slavery because now they had to serve that former plantation owner for life because a lot of them could not pay off their debts. You had segregation and Jim Crow during this time period of the nadir, all right? There are so many laws of Jim Crow, but two that I just found real quick was just the banning of interracial marriages. I wouldn't even be here, all right? And poll taxes, literacy tests, all those things to keep Blacks from voting. And last but not least, we had sundown tones and black codes. These were the informal laws that a lot of the southern states imposed, all right? A lot of this had to do with keeping Blacks from owning land or owning property. They had rules that basically said at a certain time, at 6 p.m., when you hear that siren go off, if you were Black and you were in a sundown town, you better get out because you could be killed. And Blacks and whites understood this. It wasn't written down. The Black codes weren't written down. They were informal. And guess who a lot of times enforced these informal laws? It was these slave patrols, all right, these police, if you will. Blacks had limited access to courts and all those kind of things, and they were not allowed to even testify against white people. And this is after slavery again, during this nadir period, all right? One of the craziest things about it was a lot of these former slaves, they only had one skill. They only did one thing in their life, and that was work on a plantation. They were farmers, if you will. After slavery ended, they had no other skills. They had no money. So one of the things that you saw the South do right away is they passed laws that basically were meant to arrest Black people. For example, loitering. Loitering is standing around, people. All right, or vagrancy, which means homelessness. If you were homeless or you were standing around because you had no job, you had no skills of anything else that was going on, you were arrested for 10 to 15 years. You had to serve. And of course, if you're arrested, you have no rights, you have no money. Again, another form of slavery, okay? At this point, is there any questions? I feel like I'm just doing, there's a lot I want to get through, but there's a point to all this and how we're going to transition. Any questions at this point?
There aren't any in the chat, but if someone would like to unmute and speak your question, that would be great.
Absolutely. All right, and brings us to the Klan and Birth of a Nation, okay? Birth of the Nation, I don't know how many of you guys actually seen it before, the 3 hours I think the movie is. But Birth of a Nation was a movie that was created in the the late 1910s. It was actually previewed at the White House under Woodrow Wilson. That was the debut, what do they call it? I guess when you have a screening, the opening screening was at the White House. And Woodrow Wilson said that it was history written with lightning. That's how profound this movie was, how happy he was about the movie. Now, if you watch the movie, what you will see is that Blacks which were all played by white men, by the way, in blackface, they were basically portrayed in a very negative way, okay? A lot of the blacks in the movie, you can see that there's a part where they actually become part of Congress, and they're sitting in there with their feet up, they're eating chicken, you know, they're eating watermelons, they're chasing white women around the congressional chamber, et cetera. And a very famous clip in the movie shows a white woman running away from a black man, and she just throws herself off of a cliff. She would rather die and throw herself and commit suicide than to actually be caught by this black man who was going to, quote unquote, rape her. All right. And this imagery that you see in the movie was profound at its time, because it actually, you start seeing the beginnings of a lot of where we get this idea that black men especially are savages, and they're uber strong and athletic, and they'll rape white women, and they're criminals, and all these kind of things. These stereotypes that a lot of black men have today, you see it for the first time in this movie, okay? And the Ku Klux Klan are the heroes in this movie. They are the heroes. They are celebrated. Now, what does this all mean? Okay, so you start seeing, because of white fear and this image of this black monster, savage, et cetera, because of that, you start seeing, you know, besides Jim Crow and black codes, et cetera, you see the beginning of lynchings from the late 1800s all the way through the mid 1900s, okay? And 2020, really, but we'll get to that. Again, some of these pictures are graphic, but there's a reason why I want to show them. So take a look at this picture here. You see the feet of someone who's been lynched, and then you see all the people who gather to watch this lynching. But I want to really highlight 3 or 4 young boys that are standing in the front, okay? Understand that lynchings were absolutely okay during this time period, during the Nadir.
Yeah.
Kids would get off of school early and they would like go to lynchings. They were, quote unquote, just like picnics, okay? And you see one of the boys is smiling. This idea of the black male being less than human, right? This idea that, you know, why are people screaming Black Lives Matter? Because early on in our history, we see pictures like this that show that even young kids were indoctrinated with this belief that black people or brown people, that is a picture of 2 Mexicans being hung, okay? But that black and brown people, their lives don't matter, all right? Again, you see young kids showing up to this lynching and witnessing this and being indoctrinated with this. So much so that with a little research, you find out that after they lynched somebody, they would cut up the body, they would break the bones apart, they would even destroy the tree that the lynching occurred on, and then they would sell these things to people who were at the actual lynchings. For 25 cents, you could actually buy a part of a man's bone or a woman's bone that was lynched. For 5 cents, you could buy a piece of the tree bark on which that person was lynched. It's really funny. Even in Marietta, Georgia, right down the street, there was a lynching of a man named Leo Frank, who was a Jewish man. Okay, he was accused of raping a woman. Come to find out, he didn't. But regardless, he was lynched here in Marietta, Georgia. And I know of a couple of people who actually have parts of the rope that he was lynched with, like displayed on their mantle. Okay, so just imagine again the psychology of everything that we're talking about right now. One of the most infamous, I guess, lynchings that we have is that of Emmett Till. All right, Emmett Till visiting his uncle, I think his uncle or grandfather in Mississippi. Story goes that he went to a convenience store, he whistled at a white woman told her husband, and grown men went out and found this little boy, beat him to a pulp, shot his body, threw him into a river. And his mother, as Dave Chappelle would say, was such a gangster that she said, "No, I want the whole world to see what they did to my baby." Okay. And she had an open casket funeral. This is one of the hardest pictures that I ever, show. I know it's graphic, but I bring it up because I do see a lot of similarities between what Emmett Till's mother did so that the world could see and what happened very recently with George Floyd. Because this is a lynching for the world to see. The lynching of Emmett Till actually, a lot of people say it sparked the movement for civil rights. In an interview with Vanity Fair, Reverend Jesse Jackson said when he spoke to Rosa Parks once, she said to him that she was thinking about going to the back of the bus, but then she thought about Emmett Till and she couldn't do it. Okay, so, and of course, from that, we have the Montgomery bus boycott. All right, and finishing up, because I know I am getting a little long-winded, but I think this is important for a lot of people to revisit or to know for the first time. But we had a president named Richard Nixon, came about in the late 60s, early 70s, and he had a war on drugs. When he was campaigning, he kept calling himself the law and order candidate. Somebody else has said that recently. Well, when they were campaigning, I'll let you guess who that was. But the law and order candidate, he ran on his platform of eliminating crime, but we call that dog whistle politics because everybody who heard him knew that what he really was talking about is Black people. Let's lock Black people up, okay? They actually, his team called this the Southern strategy. He knew that if he could, run on this platform of locking Black people up, that the Southern states, a lot of whom are racist, it would garner support. And it would get their vote, okay? And again, what he was trying to get at was this idea of the dangerous, angry, savage Black man. And that's kind of what this dog whistle politics was. Remember they're dangerous. Remember they're dangerous. And it all comes from that birth of a nation, okay? His advisor later on in an interview came out and admitted this very thing. He said, his name is John Ehrlichman, he was Nixon's advisor. He said the Nixon campaign in 1968 and the Nixon White House after that had two enemies, the anti-war left, or the hippies, if you remember them, they were going against the war, so was Martin Luther King, and the Black people. You understand what I'm saying, right? We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or Black, but by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and Blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did. And this again was admitted by Nixon's chief advisor, John Ehrlichman, okay?
Marvin, you have a question from Jose.
Okay, good, awesome.
Hey, Mr. Marvin, how you doing?
Hey, what's going on, Mr. Hosey?
Nothing, man. I appreciate the information you're giving. I actually typed my comments because when you were talking about, I'm old Marietta too.
Mm-hmm.
So I remember about Leo Frank, and I was I did some research when I was there because it blew my mind about that case because the streets around the Marietta Square are named for those people that lynched Leo Frank, and people still to this day will not talk about what happened to Leo Frank, and they went and got him from Milledgeville and brought him back. But I also typed in the Google for people to Google Without Sanctuary to get more information on lynching, because as you brought up, people traded cards, they took pictures, they brought picnic baskets. And as Brian Stevenson actually said, that's trauma for Black and white people. Imagine kids being raised to see a human being being burnt, mutilated, and hung in front of them, and they got a picnic basket and they're taking pictures. That is trauma. That's a lot of trauma there. So I appreciate you doing it. I typed my comment.
Absolutely. And thank you, Mr. I appreciate it. I mean, there's even a belief that that's why Black people don't have picnics, is that because the word picnic came from those lynching days. And that's why Black people have, quote unquote barbecues or cookouts or kickbacks or whatever it may be. Okay.
I'm sorry to interrupt you.
Oh, no, go ahead.
I heard that it was, I guess, a mashup of the two words. Well, not the two words, a phrase, pick a nigger, any nigger.
Yeah.
And it came together to form picnic. And, you know, whether or not that is true, it's still a connotation that is deep rooted in some really painful history.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And again, this is my last slide. There's so much I could go into, but I know we're only given an hour and I want to give our other speaker his time. But there's so much, but let's just get back to this mass incarceration real quick. Just a couple of stats. This is from the NAACP.org. But in the last 35 years, the number of incarcerated people went from 500,000 to 2.2 million in the last 25 years. And as a matter of fact, the United States makes up about 21% of all the world's prisoners. So to put that into context, 5 out of 100 people in the world are from the United States, but 1 in 5 people in the world that's in prison are here in the United States. And I'm sure we all know that a mass majority of those people are African American or Hispanic, all right? African Americans make up about 1/3 of the prison population. They're 5 times more likely to be incarcerated than a white person. And even women are twice as likely, Black women are twice as likely to be incarcerated than a white woman. When we add Hispanics to the mix, all right, we make Hispanics and Blacks make up about 1/3 of the country, but over half of the prison population. And another way to think about that is if you took Blacks and Hispanics and you incarcerated them at the same rate that white people go to prison, then we could actually, the population of prisons could decline by 40%. Basically, half of the prison population we have today would be gone if Blacks and Hispanics were actually imprisoned at the same rate, okay? So I brought all this together to just get y'all to think about this long history of what is going on right now, okay? I understand that all of us are very tired right now, tired of seeing the same things. Trust me, I know. But let's understand that this is something that has been ingrained in the fabric of this nation since day one. So with that being said, it's going to take a lot to break all these things down. One of the things that I talk to young people all the time, and Jordan's on here, she can attest to this, is that a lot of times what I say is that this generation, and mine and too, or we're like the microwave generation. We want instant gratification. We want instant gratification. I think we see it in the streets as people, you know, cities are burning. But let's try to keep that momentum throughout. Make it a lifelong venture to do right. Not just for a month, let's be upset and burn shit down and then let's move on or whatever, or become complacent again or forget, okay? So just know that there's a lot of history behind all of this. So we have to fight as vigorously as all of those people before us as well. Without further ado, I will pass it over to Jameer Stroud.
Mr. Jameer, before you go, I just want, in light of our discussion in the first session, I just want everybody to take a moment to take stock of how they feel about what Marvin just spoke about and what he shared with us, the images that you saw. Just take a moment to take stock of how you feel in this moment, because again, like we talked about before, you can't get to a place of being ready to change and being ready to, you know, fight the good fight, if you will, if you don't first take stock of your thoughts and your feelings and where you are. So just take a moment to just process and acknowledge and even give it a name, if you will, of how you feel, so that you can remember that and hold on to that as we move forward in this discussion and in the next part of the series. Thank you.
Good evening, everybody. Didn't know I was going to be in front of such an astute audience, and like Millicent just said, you kind of really need time to digest a lot of the things that Marvin was saying. I did not know the information about Marietta Square. It's mind-blowing. Kind of gives me an insight on why Cobb County Police the way they are. A lot of cops don't like Cobb County Police, but because they carry on that same, we're going to be strict in law and order, and we know who pays the price for a police department or a local government being strict on law and order. And a lot of things that Marvin was just talking about, even revisiting them, they're still prevalent today. I kind of want to start talking about what he was saying about the Black codes and the origins of formal policing. That is a huge, huge, huge nugget and a huge factor in things that we're talking about and the things that we're seeing today. It is vital to understand that not only did those slave patrols were the first form of organized policing, but when you fast forward to the 20s, and it was actually enforced all the way into the 30s, informally, but yet formally, and I explain what that means. We're talking about Black codes, altered policing of who were supposed to be free people. And now we're always talking about the policing of free people. We're talking about it going into the early 30s, where while they were enforced by these slave patrols, actual commissioned government police departments were going out of their nightly patrols and doing this. Patrolling didn't, before, you had a sheriff, somebody that would go arrest somebody if somebody did something wrong. But the idea, the system of patrolling, like Marvin said, was invented to control Black people. So the idea of the officer circling the neighborhood, being seen, being on watch in the neighborhood, it was invented in America for the purpose of keeping Black folks in line. So what we have there is already it's not that that's doomsday, but it's important for America to understand that there's already a broken relationship between African Americans or Black folks and the police. Now, as he was talking, I thought a lot about Alton Sterling. That was the case that really stuck out to me. And if we don't remember, Alton Sterling was the gentleman in New Orleans. We say he was killed for selling CDs. Kind of inaccurate, but it kind of gives it the sting. Basically, he was out in front of a store and someone saw him with a gun and called the police and said, "Hey, there's a man out here in front of the store with a gun." Police get there and he in fact does have a gun. And a lot of times the argument from folks who aren't used to seeing Black folks victimized by violence from the police, they say, well, why didn't he just comply? Why didn't he just comply? And let's go back to what Marvin said about PTSD. Excited exaggeration. You're seeing those fears. We're seeing that restlessness come about in the situation. Now you have a face. Even if it weren't those officers could have been the nicest folks in the world God ever made. But when they show up, they are the face of the things that have been oppressing you and your generation forever. So we're asking someone to stay calm, and the situation by its approach already feels hopeless by its nature. And the hardest part, and I think the thing that we're having trouble figuring out in America is, even when we have these killings that end up being justified, they go to a grand jury, and Marvin brought me on here to talk about some of those legal aspects to help us understand. So I'm going to kind of reverse into it, transferring from the social aspects of it into the legal aspects of it. When these grand juries say, okay, we didn't have enough to take this to trial, this person shouldn't be arrested, these officers shouldn't stand trial, they shouldn't be held accountable for what happened to this man. So then we have a hard time reconciling, okay, how did this man go from standing in front of a store with a gun, legal or not legal, argued all day long, to being dead? Did he have to die? And why does this keep repeating itself in the African-American community? So then we say, okay, once we break that thing down frame by frame, generally there isn't a legal system in the world that would prosecute those officers in that situation. But the problem is that keeps happening. And because America refuses to address the PTSD issue that we're having as African Americans. And what happens is, if we refuse to address it, then the same thing is going to keep on happening. And we get frustrated by the lack of accountability and as it starts to play out. I want to separate, when we talk about and still slowly backing out of the social aspect of it and going into the legal aspect of it. Generally, when we have these tragic losses of life, they're not all the same kind of homicide by cop. You have some that are just absolutely intentional evils. We can root that out of police departments. We can root that out anywhere in the world. The cop that shot my man in the back in South Carolina as he was running from a traffic stop. That was an absolute intentional, I'm going to kill you murder. Then we have a fear. This is probably the one that needs the most social reform and the most money and the most real training dumped into it, is we actually have white officers who fear Black men. And they may not be racist. They just been conditioned to actually be afraid. I'll give an example one time, back when I was working in police work, I answered a call and I had a white officer back me up in the call. Cool kid, it's about his second year in police work, he's from North Jersey. And after we clear out whatever the dispute was, we're in the barbershop actually. We break out into the ever so popular who's the greatest of all time in basketball. And like any other barbershop talk, it gets loud. We're yelling, oh, no, Kobe ain't nothing wrong. LeBron, we're yelling, everybody's excited. What you talking about? You don't know what you're saying, blah, blah, blah. And we finally get ready to wrap the conversation up. And I look at my partner, he's looking uneasy. He's like, hey, Wes, God. I say, what's wrong with you? He says, you guys are crazy. I say, crazy? What are you talking about? He goes, you guys are crazy fighting there. I say, you crazy, man. Then I stopped and I listened. I said, wait a second. Are you serious? He goes, yeah. Thought you guys were going to lose it. I said, wait a minute. You think that us yelling about who's the greatest of all time in basketball, getting in each other's faces, you actually thought we were going to come to blows? He goes, it looks that way to me. And I use it as a teaching moment to him, but then it taught me something. He had a different cultural experience. His cultural experiences thought to him, when people got like that, they were a threat. He was actually, as I'm sitting there having a great time, laughing and joking and talking about, sports, he is actually in a mode where he is ready to do battle. He's preparing himself for a fight. And that makes me, that's what I always think about when I think of Philando Castile. We talk about an officer that may or may not have been racist, but it was no doubt that he was afraid of Philando and had no real reason to be afraid. And that you can't, that you can't root out for someone coming into a police department. But I can tell you that the training to control it sucks. And that's another form of Black lives not mattering, because when we don't hold our police departments and the leadership that are over police departments accountable to make sure that those trainings are for real and not just, let's just get through this, let's just have it so we say we have to have it. Who pays the price for that? Who pays the price for people going out into the streets being equipped with guns and equipped with the legal of Black lives? We need everyone to matter enough so that these departments and that these leaders over these departments are held accountable. Another type of third reason these happen, these are fear and true racists. These are true racists that are actually fear of minorities coming into power. It goes back to what Marvin was just saying about the most recent presidential candidate, the one who holds office now in his campaign, and likened it to Nixon's campaign. If we can strike up fear in our base, that will mobilize our base to strike back so that we can control what seems to be coming into power. And all of that is based on a guilt trip that the majority has, is that there's a fear that if these folks continue to get educated, like the t-shirt said, danger educated Black man, if these folks continue to get manager positions and own companies and become millionaires, there's a chance they may come into real power and treat us the way we treated them. So we've got to stop this thing. We have to make America ours again. Excuse me, we mean great again. And what happens inside the walls of these police departments when those folks who believe that, or those folks who are going into that thing, they walk around, they feel empowered. They feel empowered to do what Officer Chauvin did out in Minneapolis. His hands in his pockets as he leaned on his neck, that was a position of power. That was a depraved indifference, as the statute actually reads, a depraved indifference for his rights. By law, by law and by oath, he has to adhere to that man's safety. He has to make sure that he's okay. The minute you try to take someone into custody, you're responsible for their care. So when you sit with your knee on their back and their neck for 8 minutes and 46 seconds and you don't care, that says something not only about your arrogance, but it says something about the fact that you don't feel any responsibility to that person in the moment. Says something about the establishment that you're working for and how they're going to back you. It says that, you know what, there's a great chance I'm not actually going to be held accountable for this. And the reason why they feel like they're actually not going to be held accountable is because the people who are supposed to hold them accountable are not adequately being held accountable. The current chief of police out in Minneapolis had previously sued the police department for systemic racism issues. Yet they weren't being held accountable to the terms of that lawsuit. And here we are today. The last one is the last type of homicide that happens in these situations are the justifier homicides that we can't seem to get reconciliation from. These are the ones that, whether they were racially driven by the officer or not, whether they were driven by the evil of the officer or not, whether they were a response of poor training or not, whether it was a black and white issue or any other minority or not a minority issue, in any court of law in any state in America and probably even beyond, the officer's response would have been justified. Yet we've left with no feeling of reconciliation because all we see is a repeated history. And legally, our criminal justice system is hiding behind those circumstances to drag their feet on reform. Meaning, and this is where I cross into the legal things, my passion is to make sure folks, and I really want to open after I kind of say this, I really want to open my section up into more so of a question and answer, because we have to break these things down really case by case. And the reason why that's necessary is because that's the way they're actually handled. We see things and we say, this is not right in the court of society. This is not right in the court of moral codes. This is not right in the court of ethics. But these officers are being taken to a court of law. So if we're going to win the fight and hold folks accountable, we have to know how to hold them accountable. And what's happening is every time we do something, not necessarily do something, every time we don't understand how to fight them on their court, on their playing field, they use that to discredit us. They use that, and when I say us, I say we, the people who are seeking change. Our change and our ways to change are being discredited because we don't know how to fight that fight. We're using the wrong terms, we're using the wrong language, we're using the wrong applications of the law, and they use that to say they don't know what they're talking about. So now we have an excuse to ignore them, which leads to less accountability. So I have a question here.
Hey, real quick, as Jay is looking that up, I do want to make mention of one thing that, Jay, that you mentioned, but I know Ms. Clay actually posted a link, and I'm so glad she did. But the link is about an article, a study that I read, that Anna shared, that non-blacks usually overestimate the age of Black people, especially Black boys. Starting at age 10, the average is up to 5 years. They overestimate someone by 5 years. So if you have a 14-year-old freshman who walks into a classroom, a non-Black teacher, for example, might actually, if that 14-year-old were to get loud or aggressive, they would see, or, having never met that person, think that that 14-year-old is actually like 19. And I think that speaks to a little bit of what Jay is talking about with that fear as well. I'm sorry,
That's
Jay,
exactly it. No, that's exactly it. These are actually things that are being justified in courts of law to get these folks off. So to answer Millicent's question, she wanted me to explain Officer Chauvin's charges out in Minneapolis, who was responsible for killing Mr. Floyd. So initially, we did not have an arrest for a while, and we were up in arms about that. And one of the valid concerns was, why is it every time the police do something, there's no rush to arrest? We see everybody else arrested immediately, but there's no rush to arrest. There's a few reasons for that, but one of them is, okay, we didn't have a rush to arrest there because you want to know what the charge is. And for a felony offense, that makes all the difference in the world, because for a felonious offense, you want to, generally in some states, you have to have a 48 hours to initiate the charges before that charge, we decide that charge sticks and we move forward. So you kind of want to get that right before you go forward. And with that particular charge, so they came up with third degree murder, and then manslaughter. And everyone was like, well, why not first degree? He clearly intended to kill him. And we have to actually look at the Minnesota statutes and see how they're laid out to understand why that was actually the proper charge initially before they were upgraded to second degree. So third degree manslaughter was kind of like, okay, if we can't get third degree, we definitely have this one. But third degree, the thing that they focused on was that he had a depraved indifference to his life. Here's someone, like I said earlier, you have a sworn officer that absolutely has to check on the well-being of someone who's in custody. You feel this person go lifeless. You feel this person not breathing anymore. You feel them go unresponsive, and you didn't even look down, and you kept your hands in your pockets. That is an indifference as to whether or not he lived or he died. When we talk about first degree or second degree murder, we're talking about some clear intentions to, okay, we're saying that this person went into the situation wanting this person to die. Now, we can decide all day long that we either yes or no, that's true or false in the court of moral ethics, whether or not that's true. But in the court of law, we have to have evidence to that intention. Now, we're unable to read minds, right? So short of reading his mind, we have to know that that's what he meant to do. So what you don't want to do is you don't want to rush to make that arrest. Of course, everyone wanted to hurry up and make the arrest. But if you actually have evidence of a person's intention going into the encounter, then you want to take time to look for it. You want to take time to talk to his neighbors, talk to his coworkers. You want to take time to look at his previous history with disciplinary action. You want to take time to read the mobile messages that are being sent between officers in the cars. Take the time to see what kind of websites he subscribes to, what kind of membership organizations he may be a part of. You might look deep into that stuff and find out he is a part of a hate group. I'm just using this as an example. What you don't want to do is hurry up and make an arrest and have that information out there and you miss it. One of the cases that we saw in modern times where that happened was the Rodney King case. State of California took the officers that beat Rodney King to trial without doing a thorough investigation, as LAPD has been known not to do. And those officers got off. Well, then when it came time around for the federal trial, the feds, as they tend to do, they did a very thorough investigation. What they did was they looked at those computer messages the officers sent each other from car to car. And they saw that night that they loaded up, two of those officers sent each other a message that said, let's go kick some cans tonight. Cans meaning Africans, Mexicans, and any other minority that ends with cans. They went out there with the intention of doing someone harm. And they found that evidence, and that was like the thing that was able to bury them in that case. So what you want to do is you want to take that time to find that. Now, while the other three officers weren't immediately arrested, I've heard someone say, I heard a lawyer say, well, if it were anybody else but cops, they would have been complicit to murder. That's not always true. The reason is they did have a duty to intervene, which is a charge for that. There's a violation of oath of office in many states. But in this particular situation, them being there and also being officers, evidence-wise, does not automatically make them complicit in what Officer Chauvin was actually doing. So it does not make it, so them actually being there does not say, okay, they're actually thinking what he was thinking, and they actually wanted the end to come that he wanted to come. And even if that were actually true, we have to have evidence of that. Again, we can't read minds. And then the other problem with that was after they found that third-degree murder was to be the appropriate charge for Officer Chauvin, what they said was statutorily out there in Minnesota, you cannot have an accomplice to third-degree murder. So you can't charge these other officers to a crime, to be an accomplice to a crime that actually cannot have an accomplice. So that's where we see the bump up to second-degree murder once they charge these other officers, because you can have an accomplice to second-degree murder. What I do hope is that they, in interviewing these officers and doing that extra digging that we're all hoping that they would do, that they did actually find evidence to support a second-degree murder. We must brace ourselves and be prepared for some light sentencing, because sentencing is usually structured and it's heavily based on prior criminal history, which obviously they don't have any. But also the likelihood of there being a federal charge after, generally federal charges initiate after the state charges are complete. So they're likely going to stand some sort of a federal trial as well, and get some time from that. Let's hope that's likely what's going to happen. But that's also, on the books as well. Any other questions?
Mr. Stroud, I don't see any questions in the chat at this moment.
I got one.
I have a,
Oh, go
No,
ahead. Go
Millicent
ahead, Jordan.
has her hand raised and Deja has her hand raised.
Go ahead. You guys go
Okay.
ahead. I was just going to ask something if nobody was going to say anything. But go ahead, Jordan. Bailey, or I'm sorry, I don't know who the other person was.
Deja has a question too.
Deja, you can go first because I just popped in.
Oh, no, it's fine. It was, thank y'all both for your presentation or your talking points. It was a lot of information in both of those. For the first one, I just had a question about the convict leasing, just because I was kind of confused on the way it was described, because it reminded me more of like sharecropping or tenant farming, and convict leasing is more so like prisons that like give their prisoners, like lease their prisoners out to private companies. So the original ways that we used to see that are like they used to have like prisoners working the mines. So like instead of actually being in prison, they would lease them out to like these mining companies, and the prisons would get the money for it, and the private companies would have like, cheaper labor that they wouldn't have to pay as much for. And then the sharecropping or tenant farming, which are different but have a lot of similarities, are more so what I felt like you were talking about, where Black people primarily were given a plot of land on a white person's property, and then having to like give them a share of their crops and like work back their debt that they're in. And a lot of times they, like you said, would get inside so much debt that they couldn't work their way out of it, and it was just like them being in slavery again. So it's just like a kind of a point of clarification that I wanted to make, because I was just kind of confused on how it was described.
Mr. Finney, would you like to clarify a little bit more?
I'm sorry, I stepped away for a second. I really do apologize. What was the question?
Deja was asking for clarification on convict leasing. She gave an explanation of, well, basically there was some similarities between convict leasing and then sharecropping.
Yeah, same thing. Sharecropping right after the slavery, same thing. They would then have to work for their former slave owners. They were indebted to them, those same kind of things. Now with the convict leasing, I think I said that wrong actually. So the convict leasing, same thing. Once they became in prison, they were then lent out, loaned out, if you will, on plantation owners, where they did the same thing as sharecropping. But in both situations, what you saw was it was just an attempt to have Black people work for free again.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, as I thought that's what you meant. I was just like wanted to like the clarification, and that a lot with like sharecropping and like tenant farming, like they are free, like they're not even prisoners, but they just become imprisoned within that system
through debt, right? And a lot of it just had to do with debt. They couldn't pay their debts back to those slave owners, so they were indebted to them, and they had to work off their debt, which many of them never did. Absolutely. Sorry for the confusion. Thank you for pointing that out too.
Bailey J, did you want to go ahead and ask your question?
Yeah, I just wanted to ask, so I know you discussed the different kind of like how, you know, killing by cop falls into different categories of like the justified and then like the very much like disregard for human life and then the very intentional. If you've seen, you know, the footage of the Rayshard Brooks killing, how do you feel that falls on the scale?
So that one, oh gosh, that one actually is that's going to be an interesting legal battle because it goes up on the cusp of some standing law, and there's so many layers of that legally. But I'll start with the biggest one. The biggest one when an officer faces that's been the established rule by the Supreme Court has been, what would a reasonable officer do in that situation? Not necessarily what they would agree or disagree, but what the court standard is, if you insert any other reasonably minded officer in that situation where they find your off, would you find your actions unreasonable? From talking with several other officers, me being a former officer, most people I know would not have pulled the trigger in that situation. Most officers that have been on the street for more than a year or two have been in that situation. That struggle that took place with Mr. Brooks, that's like a normal week. That happens at least once a week when you're working in the urban area. Like you work in Atlanta, College Park, East Point, like that, and that's going to happen once a week, okay? If you work in certain types of areas. And very rarely, I mean, that's probably one happening in Metro Atlanta right now. Very rarely anywhere does that end in someone shot or dead. That's the part that they're going to have trouble getting over as officers. The only pushback the officers are giving, the officers who are in defense of, you know, saying that maybe I wouldn't have done it, but I see what's justified, is when officers are trained with the tasers, they're kind of given this kind of grain of salt in tasers, like they are with any other weapon. If somebody gets a hold of your mace, somebody gets a hold of your taser, they can incapacitate you and then have access to your gun. So that's why it's sort of a deadly situation. I see that logic. Doesn't mean it's always applicable. And I use an example. There was one time where I actually got drugged with a traffic stop, same way that the traffic stop almost happened with those Morehouse and Spelman students down in the protest. Almost exact same situation, except I actually still had a hold of the door and I got drugged. And they were found not guilty of assaulting me because the judge, and I actually, even though I was the quote unquote victim, I actually understood where the judge was coming from. The judge said, hey, they were trying to get away. It wasn't their intention to assault you. They saw you opening the door, getting ready to arrest them. They just wanted you to get away. You happened to get drugged in the process. So I got a knee injury for the rest of my life for free. But I actually understood that. So I applied that to what happened to Mr. Brooks. And even if someone goes with the consciousness of, okay, well, because he actually did deploy, if you look at the tape, he actually did deploy the taser at the officer. But clearly his intention is to get away and not to do the officer harm. I mean, heck, when they were struggling, he didn't really take blows. He was just trying to get them off of him. He didn't really take the opportunity to strike him. So even though that's like the major pushback the officers are giving, as most officers aren't buying it, and a court of law probably won't buy it, the only other issue going into that situation that is heavy talk in the legal community, especially law enforcement community, is it's the Atlanta Police Department. And just 2 weeks ago, maybe 3 now, you had 8 officers fired and 6 of them prosecuted for using a taser. And they were charged with assault with a deadly weapon. The taser being named the deadly weapon. And the exact district attorney that brought those charges against them announced 2 days ago that he's going to bring charges against these officers for an unreasonable shooting of Rayshard Brooks. Now the taser isn't a deadly weapon. 2 weeks later, same police department, same district attorney saying, well, when it was used against officers, when the officers were using it on somebody, it was a deadly weapon. But when it was used against them, it wasn't a deadly weapon. Now, the reality is, when deployed properly, the taser is not a deadly weapon. That's been accepted by the federal courts, the state courts, the legal community, as well as the scientific community. When its uses are proper and it's properly deployed, it is not a deadly weapon. And the District of Fulton County District Attorney knew that. He made those charges based on political pressures. Those were improper charges. But that's the thing that we have to watch out for, because what he did was he changed the rules according to who was playing the game. And that's not what we need in our government. But now what you have effectively done is sort of given these officers can say, hey, they've got a defense now. The district attorney, who is the chief law enforcement officer for the county that I work in, said that this weapon that was pointed at me is a deadly weapon. So that authorized me to meet it with deadly force. So that's why we have to always hold our leaders accountable, because they create these situations where they can potentially, I still think it'll work out, but they can potentially give somebody an out for senseless death.
Thank you so much for that.
Any more questions?
Millicent, did you still have a question?
No, mine was gonna be just about for him to discuss more about what makes a homicide justifiable. But I think he kind of talked about it in that last answer when talking about, you know, a deadly weapon and whatnot. So again, it was really just to kind of keep the conversation going, because it didn't seem like anybody was gonna ask a question before.
Okay.
I do want to expand on that, because that's a great point. So every state actually has their own standard for when an officer can use deadly force. Georgia actually has like really high standards. Like Georgia puts an officer in a position where they're almost can easily be killed before they can respond with deadly force by statute, the way it works out in the court system. So remember, laws are things on paper, but the court determines how those laws are enforced. Other states, like North Carolina, for example, South Carolina, they give a lot of leeway to when an officer can use deadly force. So when we see these shootings and we see, okay, the grand jury decided to take this one to trial, but not this one, we have to remember that they're not being held to the same legal standard across the board.
Thank you, Jay. One of the things that A.W.A.K.E, all of us, when we were planning this forum, we really wanted to get Jameer's perspective, because there's a lot of things when I spoke to Jay that he educated me on. I think, like most of us, when we found out about the lynching of George Floyd, we wanted immediate arrests. We wanted like trial tomorrow. Let's put him under the prison. And that's how I felt. But I think in speaking to Jameer, he gave me a different perspective, and not to condone anything that happens. I still think they need to be thrown under the prison, right? But it did allow me to take my emotions out and understand this process, this legal process that has to, whether, so even speaking to Jay, now we can talk about reforming the legal process, right? Like that's absolutely something that needs to happen. But the way it is written right now, it gave me a little bit of perspective to understand, okay, they couldn't just do the arresting right then and there. And I think that was important, because I think I was ready to go out and burn something down too. But I think, you know, having that perspective is really important, whether we agree with it or not. Now, if we don't agree with it, that's when we go and we start making some calls for reform and those kind of things. But I think it is important for us to equip ourselves with a little bit of legal understanding in all of these situations. I do want to just honor you guys' time. We are now at 7:40. This part of the series is, I guess, done time-wise. I do want to, again, just point you guys to the chat. I'm going to leave this room open for a little bit so I can point you guys to the chat, because there are a lot of links that people posted in that I think are great places to go and educate ourselves and empower ourselves. And I also want to make mention of our last conversation of this series will be on Thursday at the same time, 6:30, this Thursday. And we're going to take a look at like our next, what are our actions moving forward, ways to actually get involved, ways to make a difference, ways to make change and be a change agent, and to get other people on board. We're going to have some good speakers on that. Ms. Bailey Jordan is going to be a part of that, and Mr. Chance. I'm forgetting somebody.
Ms. Cooper.
Ms. Cooper is going to be on there. So it's going to be a really powerful, another powerful conversation and a very important one, because I know a lot of us right now are at a point where we're like, okay, I'm done talking. Mr. P, I love you, but I already know the history. You taught it to me in high school. I have Google. I can look that stuff up. I get it. I'm ready for action. I'm ready to move. I'm tired of talking. Well, Thursday is that conversation that we're going to have. I'm very thankful for all of y'all who signed in and are on this call. I see there's 33 participants. This is amazing. And I am hoping that if each one of you invites at least one person for our Thursday conversation, we can get to 66. And I think the message and what we're doing is very important, very needed, very powerful. And I do want this to be shared with everybody. So without further ado, I do want to thank y'all. And again, I'm gonna leave this open just for a little while so you guys can scroll through the chat and, you know, get any information you need, or if anybody needs to yell at the screen right now, you can do that.
Miss
But
Wendy, can you close us out?
Ms. Wendy, can you close us out?
So hi, everybody. So we've heard a lot of things, a lot of information, all of it true, all of it real, and the feelings that we're feeling, the atmosphere that we're in, it is real. And I definitely want to thank Marvin and our other speaker for giving us all of that information, because the biggest thing that we need to do is, like they said, trust the process. You may not trust the legal system, but we need to trust the process. And I like to liken it to just a quick analogy of when Moses was sent to free the Israelites in Egypt. 10 times he went before Pharaoh, let my people go. And every time he went, the Bible says that Pharaoh hardened his heart harder and harder against what God was trying to do in that hour. And so I want to encourage you, as you see how our past has been and things have been so hard, and you see what is happening before us, that it looks like a daunting task. All of us of all races, all ages, we were born for such a time as this. You are in the right place. You are doing the right things. This is the time you were built for. This is what you're supposed to be doing. Keep your hand to the plow, as we would say in the church. Just keep moving forward and trust the process. You might not trust the legal system, but you need to trust the process of what we're doing. Remember that in the end, Pharaoh brought about his own demise by the hardening of his heart. We can see that just with what happened in the Supreme Court for the LGBTQ community. Because Pharaoh's heart was so hardened about legal things for that minority, we had to legalize their rights, and that was their own doing. So I just want to encourage us. I know that sometimes we feel hopeless and we feel helpless. We as leaders, I know there are leaders of all kinds on this call tonight. We have got to do our part and trust the process, because in the end, the Israelites were freed. They were, they were freed and they were let go, and they became a great nation. But you have to remember that story was not easy. It didn't come without a cost. It didn't come without death. It didn't come without work. And it didn't come without everybody doing their part. I thank everybody on here that is not a person of color. We all have a part to play in this, and it is dangerous for everyone here. So I don't know if you want me to pray us out or just close us out, but I do want to say that I will be covering each and every one of you for the things that you're doing. Those of you protesting, those of you lifting your voices, those of you posting, those of you planning, those of you that are going to go back into your jobs where Pharaoh is waiting, and you're determined not to turn back. We have you covered. Just be of good cheer in these times. You're doing the right thing. That's all I want to say.
Thank you, Wendy.
Thank you, Wendy.
Well, everybody, like I said, thank you guys for coming in. We'll officially close now. Like I said, I'll keep this this chat open though, so in case there's any links or anything people want to click on or save or whatever it may be.
And I have to go, but Marvin, as I shared with you earlier before we started the call, y'all, it's my passion to, if I have information or if I know how to access it, to anything that brings understanding, enlightenment, answers to why, how do we, what's the best way. Please, 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 no one hesitate to contact me, email me, hit me up on Facebook, whatever, because I love sharing that information.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Jay.
And Jay,
Jameer,
also, just
do you
real
want to
quick,
share your contact info?
I was going to say just a real quick pub. I was going to say Jay has a podcast that he does as well. Really, really informational, powerful, is great. It's called Truth No Chaser. You could actually look that up as well on Facebook, on Instagram, Facebook, and follow his podcast because they have these conversations on there as well. So greatly appreciate it.
Gonna be starting one in about 10 minutes actually. So
all right, yep. There you go.
So y'all have a good evening.
All right, thank you.
I'm gonna put Jay's information in here real quick, Joe.
I'm just happy to see some of my
former students,
Carter and Demetrius and who else is on here? Who else we got on here? Let me scroll through.
Cares.
I see Miss Garvey. Hello, Miss Garvey. Who's on here?
Cares.
Oh, Karis. Where's she
Karis.
at? She disappeared on me. Where's she at?
What's up?
What's up? There she
Hey,
is.
Karis.
Hey,
Hello.
Demetrius might have taken over as the biggest fan of ours. Dummies
Discuss.
Man.
Does anybody have any more questions or anything?
I like your background, Ms. Chandler.
Thank you.
I like
Thank
the
you.
snuggle.
Just, it's just some inspirational words and things. Can you read it?
Yes.
Yeah, I kind of stole it, literally.
It's just borrowed.
I felt like crying at one point, guys. I think listening to a lot of the information that you were sharing, Marvin, took me to a place of just, it's not that long ago.
No, it's not.
We're not far removed from those generations of people who fought and lost their lives so that we could be here today. And one thing that I'm really passionate about is reading. So all of the information that was posted in the chat, the links that were shared, I'm going to go back and tap into all of that information. Mm-hmm. When you talked about the Nadir, I never knew that was actually a thing, that it had a name for that time period. It's just some things that have not been shared, in school. You have to go out there and find that information on your own. Teach your kids, teach your friends' children. If you have to buy a book for someone, do that.
Yeah.
We
absolutely.
have to start imparting wisdom, because a lot of times our kids are lost. They're just focused on what's in front of them at the moment. They're not thinking about how the past is impacting them now and what they can do to affect change in the future. We have to be the ones to say those things to them and encourage them on their journey to finding the answers. Not just giving them the information, but saying, go out, learn it for yourself, and then let's have a discussion about it.
Absolutely.
One of the things that, I like to share with young people, or just with us as a people, we're really not that old. You know what I'm saying? If you look at us as a people, evolving, okay, evolution has only been taking place since 1865. So 1865 to 1965, that's 100 years that you were under grave oppression. We've only had from 65 till now we're still fighting for a place. And so a lot of times I like to compare that, because I'm a preacher, to the evolution of, the Jewish people, the Israelites, right? So you're talking about 2,000 years ago that they have been able to evolve to be a people of power, of standing, of getting through certain things. We're not even 100 years in to having political power, having economic autonomy, or this oppression that we're under. We're still evolving. So we need to take some pressure off of ourselves and then understand the great things that we have done in less than 100 years. And then the other part of that is we shouldn't even exist as a people. Like, we shouldn't even be here, right? Here we stand yet again, the people that are about to shift the entire earth yet again. We did it once in the 1960s, giving human rights what the platform for what human rights is for the world has been used. And here we are again, shifting the world about human rights. That is something that even in what we call the post-traumatic slave syndrome, we need to start having some pride in, even though it is such a heavy weight to carry. That makes sense?
Yeah. And I want to piggyback off of something. And since everybody's still on here, all 29 of y'all, look, don't give me more time. I'll talk. You guys know it. Look at my team. Stop it, Bailey. But I just want to share this. This is actually a graphic that kind of I would just show my students sometimes just to think about. But here we see American slavery, right? That whole, I'm colorblind. Is that red? That red part, there you go. That's slavery, right? 246 years from the first slaves that arrived on our shores. The ending of the Civil War, and then we had segregation, Jim Crow. And it actually goes all the way up until, let's say, Civil Rights Movement and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. So all of this time, Blacks have been, quote unquote, enslaved, right? And then we'll call this rest of this time, quote unquote, free. And I think sometimes when I show this to my students, just giving them that visual, it reminds us that the way I do it with my students is, let's say it is 1965. I say, imagine you dated somebody for this long. You dated somebody for that long. Do you really think you're gonna get over them in a couple months? It doesn't work that way, right? So I totally agree with you, Wendy. I totally agree.
And Marvin?
Yes, sir.
Not only that, I mean, legislatively, civil rights was in 1964, but
right.
you have the executive branch where people weren't wanting to enforce that legislation.
Yeah, absolutely. That's why I said quote unquote free. Yeah.
Even after, yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well,
I have something to say. I posted it, but at the Education for Black Lives Matter, one of the students was talking about how education is not really helping. And it clicked in my mind how she was like, all these pictures are all black and white. Like the books should have some color, visual, something, because she was like, in my mind, she really thought that happened so long ago. They didn't even have color pictures. Come to find out, you can see Martin Luther King in color. Like, it's not that, it wasn't that long ago, but she was talking about how she felt like that's how his history education has let them down, is giving these figures as if it was so long ago, when really, like to Wendy's comment, it wasn't that long ago. Like, people still alive.
Yeah, and that black and white coloring of the pages also goes towards that implicit bias that we have about, lighter images being good, darker images being bad. And I say this on a personal note, well, I'm not even gonna get into that, but it plays into that part as well, and continuing that thought process of white is right and dark is not, that kind of thing. So I think adding some color to the books would go against maybe, some implicit bias that maybe the publisher was intentional about, or the persons who support those organizations and who feed money to those publishing companies and whatnot. Because, if we have a world of people who see the world in gray instead of in black and white, then what do? Then we have a world of people who have morals, and then they can't get away with some of the things that they've been getting away with for so long.
Just a little side note, still trying to piggyback off what you guys said. I was showing Millicent this earlier, but several years ago, I got a random message on Facebook Messenger, a guy named Tennessee Spalding. He was like, hey, maybe we're related. Come to find out, his great-grandfather inherited the Tennessee plantation in Augusta, Georgia. If we go to Augusta, Georgia right now, there's a Finney Plantation, Finney Road, Finney Swamp. And his great-grandfather, like, inherited that. So we're talking, this is not that long ago. It's not that long ago. But, yeah.
And little does he know, right, that you're like, yeah, we're related, all right.
I wanted to reply back. Yeah,
your great-great-grandfather owned my great-great.
That's what I was going to say. Your family owned my family is what I was going to reply, but I didn't want to be.
Welcome, brother.
Yeah. All right, y'all. Well, anybody need a little bit more time for the chat, or are we good?
Nobody wants to go anywhere. It's not like we got anywhere else to go, right?
I put it in the chat, but Ruby Bridges, who's the first child who was in like integrated schools, is like barely older than my mom.
Mm-hmm.
I think my mom is on this call, so sorry, Mom, I'm exposing your age.
Yeah, Ruby Bridges is still alive, guys.
She's like
66.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate you guys. Let's do me a favor.
Awesome.
Next Thursday.
Be the first person. Oh, go ahead, Marvin.
I was gonna say Thursday, y'all. Again, y'all, that's I think, in my opinion, personally, not to downplay our first session or this session we just had, but that one on Thursday, the next steps to take action part is gonna be really important. So I really do hope that you guys all make it, and everybody bring a friend. Seriously, everybody bring a friend. All right, I'm done.
All right. Paul, you had something to say to end with?
I was just saying I was going to be the first person to drop off. I've been in front of the computer for about 10 hours today, so
well, bye.
It was great, guys.
Thank you, everybody.
Good night, everybody.
All right, everybody.